And you say, yes, I moved there in July 91. And then you say some other things. And then in the fourth line you say, I didn't really do anything of substance to the property for 12, 18 months, something like that. I then started to get various bits of work done, go relatively slowly, and as I could afford to get them done bit by bit. That accurately describes the first 18 months or so in which you were occupying the Abbotsford property?
Yes, it does.
And you say, I remember commenting to Jeff, is that Mr Shaw?
Yes, it was.
At one point, I renovated so slowly other people would call it maintenance because not much was happening. And then you say substantial renovations got done on the property last year, which included the kitchen being entirely redone, bathroom and laundry redone, internal plastering, etc. And you say at the top of the next page, I got all that work done in September, October, November-ish last year. That's 1994.
Yes, it is.
And then Mr Gordon asked you another question. And then you go through it, as you say, piece by piece. I'm not going to go through it item by item, but you say, I originally got glasswork and paving work done. That was because of the way in which the glasswork and paving were done at that time was causing water to go into the foundations. I contracted with a glassworker called Athol James, and then you say I got 3 quotes and picked the lowest. And that accurately describes what occurred.
Yes, it does.
And then come further down the page at about point 8, you say, I had a long-term plan to fix the bathroom and laundry. Both were a sort of 70s renovation, which amongst other things was red and yellow in colour. I therefore wanted to get it replaced. I went away for a holiday in late August, early September last year. Now pausing there, that's 1994.
Yes,
right?
It is.
And I'd been talking for a long time about getting this bathroom and laundry work done. And Bruce, whilst I was away, decided I should just get it done. So he commenced with a group of friends demolishing the bathroom. And that's what happened, was it?
Yes, that's right.
So you had gone away, obviously, without him for a period of time. You went overseas?
No, I think I went on a holiday to Queensland.
Oh, wherever. You went away and you came back and you discovered that he had demolished the bathroom.
Yes, that's right.
Well, that must have been a interesting homecoming, but in any event, you say, by the time I came back, the bathroom had been demolished, so I had no option but to get the rest of the renovations done. And a series of tradespeople who Jim Collins predominantly organised. Well, let's just look at that a bit more closely. So you came back, the bathroom had been demolished, so you had no option at that point but to get the rest of the renovations done. And you say a series of tradespeople who Jim Collins predominantly organised, Jim Collins being an organiser at the AWU. Now, he worked with Mr Wilson, did he?
Yes, he did.
But in substance, Mr Wilson was organising the tradespeople, wasn't he?
Jim Collins was recommending people and they were performing the work.
Well, is this the position? You came back and found the bathroom had been demolished and you said to Mr Wilson, well, you better fix this up.
No.
Right.
I'd been talking about getting the renovations done for quite a long period of time. Bruce Wilson obviously thought I should get on with it and created circumstances where I had to get on with it. Jim Collins recommended a series of tradespeople and I dealt with them and they performed work and I paid them.
Well, and then it says, then you say a series of tradespeople came in, did the renovation, which predominantly consisted of the bathroom, completing the kitchen, tiling on the kitchen floor, plastering work, replacement of ceilings and the like. So it was quite a major renovation, correct?
It was the biggest single renovation I had done.
Mm-hmm. And
at this home.
Yep. And then that work then commenced, if you go back to 148, in September, October. Well, I'm sorry, it commenced in September and continued through October and into November, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So you came back from your holiday in early September, that's at the bottom of page 148, and the work got underway that very month.
Yes, it did.
And that was a quite a substantial piece of work requiring, as it said here, the bathroom had been demolished, so that had to be done, completing the kitchen, tiling on the kitchen floor, plastering work, replacement of ceilings and the like. That's at 149. Now, you didn't get any quotes or the like from any tradesmen?
My recollection is I wanted to get on with this job, obviously, given the state of the house and that Jim Collins was in a position to recommend people. I thought he would make good recommendations, and so I relied on that.
You weren't concerned to get comparable quotes in the way that you'd done when you caused work to be done in the previous year or two, as you describe in 147. You say there you got 148, you say you got 3 quotes, pick the lowest one.
On this occasion, I wanted to just get on with it.
Well, in fact, just got on with it. It was done, the work started a matter of a few days virtually after you came back from your holiday.
I don't remember the exact time period between me returning and the work starting, but the work started soon after. I couldn't give you a count of days or weeks.
You didn't trouble to do any budget or costing or anything of that kind?
I'd been talking about getting these renovations done for a long period of time. I was, confident I had, between doing things like extending my mortgage and relying on my salary, I was confident that I was able to finance them. I just hadn't got around to organising them and getting them done. So
is the answer to my question that you didn't do any budgeting or costing or anything of that kind?
The answer to your question is having done some renovations, thinking I had in my mind an order of magnitude of likely costs of these renovations and thought I would be in a position to finance them.
Well, so the answer to my question is you didn't do any budgeting or costing of any kind?
I didn't sit down and write a budget, if that's what you mean, Mr. Stolger, no.
You left it to Bruce through Jim Collins to arrange?
The work commenced, getting quotes, quotes as in likely expenditure from the individual tradespeople, paid invoices, made arrangements with the bank to extend my mortgage in order to finance the renovations.
Well, if you come back to 149, Mr. Gordon asks you about halfway down the page, in terms of the tradesmen who did the work, who were they? You say, I don't recall their names. I have some of their receipts at home. When you had organised the tradesman yourself, such as Athol James, you certainly remembered him?
Yes, I remembered Mr. James. He came on more than one occasion to my home.
Well, he was practically living there at one point, correct?
I used that form of words in this interview, but I got him back to do, I think it was 3 pieces of work, and so I remembered him because he had done work over an extended period of time at my home.
You say that, this is in 149, halfway down the page, I don't recall their names, I have some of their receipts at home. Who had the other receipts?
I was the only person who would have had receipts.
Well, you say further in that paragraph, I do have a series of receipts. This is at the end of that same paragraph. I do have a series of receipts from various of them about bits of work that was done. Does that mean that some of the tradesmen did not supply receipts?
No, it does not.
Well, isn't that the natural reading of what you've said there? I have a series of receipts from various of...
What those words mean and my recollection of these events is clearly the question of renovations at my home had become somewhat controversial and remarked upon. I commenced to pull my receipts together. I'd been through the receipts prior to this interview. After this interview, I continued to pull all my receipts together and to study them to satisfy myself that I had paid for all renovations at my home.
Well, you say when you were doing the interview, you said, I have a series of receipts from various of them about bits of the work that was done. It suggests that some of them hadn't given you receipts and there was other work in respect of which there was no receipts.
That's not what I meant by those words.
And what, you didn't have any quotes from any of these tradesmen?
No, the way I went about it is as I've described to you.
You didn't have any contracts with any of them?
Obviously had oral contracts with them, agreements with them that they would perform the work and that I would pay their accounts when they were rendered.
Well, agreements entered into by either Mr Wilson or Mr Collins on his behalf with these tradesmen, is that right?
No.
Well, you didn't enter into any agreements with these tradesmen, did you?
I entered into agreements with them they performed the work, so I knew that they were coming to my home, I knew that what work they were going to perform. I'd sought estimates of the amount of money that would be required to pay them, and when it was necessary to pay them, and receipts were, invoices is the more proper expression, when invoices were given to me, I paid them.
What, you say that... I'm sorry? When you say invoices were given to you?
When these tradespeople rendered their accounts.
Well, that's not what you say in your interview, is it? You say you have receipts from these tradespeople. That's very different from invoices, isn't it?
I think there's a series of things you get from tradespeople. You get their bill, you pay their bill, and then you get a receipt for the monies paid.
Well, some people do, but do you say in your evidence now that you received invoices from these tradesmen?
Yes, I do.
Where do I find that in either your statement? Well, let's start with your statement. Where do I find that in your statement?
I think it's comprehended by the expression, I do have a series of receipts. What I meant was I'd been, invoiced and paid.
You've been answering questions about these issues for many years, correct?
I most certainly have, Mr Stolger.
And you've never before suggested that you had anything from these tradesmen other than receipts, have you?
I'm not putting it as a stylised term of art the way you are.
It's not a stylised term of art, Ms Gillard. These are simple English words, aren't they? Invoices and receipts.
Yes, they are. And when you read all of this, which is a, fairly contemporaneous recollection,
yes.
What it is telling you is that tradespeople came, tradespeople performed work. I obviously got invoices to know how much to pay them. I paid them and they gave me receipts.
Well, all you have ever said to date is that you received receipts from some of these tradesmen.
I think, just before you proceed with that question,
yes.
If you look at the second witness statement, paragraph 11, the fourth last line and the last line.
Yes, that is dealing with an invoice from Mr Spiridis, as I understand it.
Your question may need qualification.
Yes, save for the just for clarity, Ms Gillard. You have made in your evidence references to an invoice from Mr Spiridis, and you have also, in fairness to you, I think made reference to invoices from Mr James. In any event, there may be invoices from Mr James in evidence, but save for those two pieces of evidence, you have not previously deposed that you received anything other than receipts from the tradesmen who did work on your house in 1994. That's right, isn't it?
Well, the form of words here in what is referred to as page 149 in these documents from my discussion with Mr Gordon and Mr Shaw in 1995, I'm talking about having occasion over the course of the weekend to look through my personal records. I do have a series of receipts. I used that form of words then. I'd only have had a series of receipts if I'd been invoiced and knew how much to pay.
Well, you may have been This is really the point, isn't it? That if payments are made by cash, you may not have receipts for every payment. That's right, isn't it?
I paid for renovations by cheque.
By cheque?
Yes.
Every item of work that was done was paid for by cheque?
It was my practice to pay by cheque.
Now, where do I find in your statement the proposition that all of the work that was done in 1994, so setting aside Mr Spiritus and Mr James, was paid for by cheque?
I don't recall being asked that in the course of this discussion with Mr Shaw and Mr Gordon.
No, I'm sorry, in your statement of evidence to this commission, do you give that evidence in your statement?
Oh, sorry. Do I give that evidence in my statement to the Commission?
Yes.
I think in my statement I talk about paying from my own funds, but I'm happy to go to the individual paragraphs.
Yes, well, paragraph 26, for example.
Yes.
Simply says...
My renovations on my property were paid from my own money, which was either derived from a loan from the bank or from my salary. Yes,
but you say that, in fact, payments were made by cheque. Is that your evidence?
Yes.
And then... Mr Collins had organised the tradesman.
Yes, that's right.
Did he hand over the cheques or did you?
I would have, depending on the circumstances, I would have handed a cheque, or there may have been times that I posted a cheque.
See, the position is that you would not know. I mean, you were maintaining your practice at this time, I take it?
Yes, I was.
So you were a partner at Slater and Gordon during these months?
Yes, I was.
And were you annoyed that Mr Wilson had smashed up your bathroom?
It wasn't my preference, no.
You had left it to him or to Mr Collins to organise these tradesmen?
Mr Collins recommended tradesmen. That obviously assisted with organising the works, but in terms of, picking tiles, picking colours, all of those kinds of things that you do associated with renovations, I did those things. I paid for the work.
You did those things, but you would not know on a day-by-day basis who was doing what work, would you?
I would know that there were tradespeople at work in my home. They were at work in my home over a period of time.
But Mr Wilson obviously had access to the home?
Yes, so we could have access to the home.
And he or Mr Collins were organising the tradesmen?
They didn't need someone supervising them as they went about the work. Once it was apparent that, take an example, the bathroom needed to be tiled, then the tiler would get about tiling the bathroom. No one needs to be standing over his shoulder as he's doing that. Yeah,
quite so, but the position is that either Mr Wilson or Mr Collins on his behalf may have paid some of the tradesmen who were coming in and out and you wouldn't know anything about it.
That's not possible because...
Well, it is possible, isn't it?
Mr Stolger, at the time of all of this in 1995,
yes.
I took steps to satisfy myself that looking at the amount of work that had been performed on my home, that I had paid for it all, that I had documents, receipts, invoices that showed that I'd paid for it all. At the time of this interview in 1995, it was obviously during what was a stressful period in my life.
Yes.
I'd not fully satisfied myself at the point of this interview. I took further steps to fully satisfy myself.
Well, you took further steps by looking at further receipts, is that right?
That's right, and looking around my home, looking at what had been done and satisfying myself that I had paid for what had been done.
the whole point of, well, I'll withdraw that. If payments are made in cash, it's entirely possible that no receipt is issued, correct? As a matter of practice.
But that's not relevant. If you look around and you've had painting done, and you have a receipt for the amount of monies that you've paid the painter.
Do you accept my proposition that, as a matter of theory, if payments are made in cash, the recipient of the cash payment may or may not issue a receipt?
Well, I don't think we're here to deal with matters of theory, Mr. Stolger.
Probably won't. That's right, isn't it?
I didn't hear you, sorry.
The person receiving the cash may well not issue a receipt. That's right, isn't it?
I am sure that in our big wide world that there are tradespeople who take cash and don't issue receipts. It was my practice to pay by cheque.
See, the position as at September 1995 was... I withdraw that. The position when you gave the interview to Mr Gordon and Mr Shaw, as at that day, was that you weren't certain whether you had paid for the work yourself. Is that right?
That's right, and the interview records it.
And Mr Gordon asks you on page 150, top of the page, is it fair to say as a general summary of that work that all of the work was paid for by you? And you say, I believe all the work was paid for by me. The words I believe suggest you weren't sure about it, correct?
If you look across this interview, what you see is me indicating that I believed that I paid for all of the work. I couldn't see how it was possible that I hadn't paid for all of the work. I say that I've been looking at my records subsequent to the interview. I took more steps to get all of my records in one place and to go through them forensically, and to satisfy myself I paid for all of the work.
Well, I know you're anxious to say that you checked your records after the date of the interview, but if we could just focus on the interview for the moment. You say, I believe all of the work was paid for by me. I was getting receipts. I was paying it. And then if one comes to page 153, you're giving a long answer which I won't take you through, but towards the bottom of that page you say, I will meet with Bob as soon as possible for the purpose of clarifying that matter. That's Mr Bob Smith. And you say, I believe that must be the source of the rumour. That must be the factual construct behind what has become the rumour about the association or Bruce or the union. And then you say, I can't categorically rule out that something at my house didn't get paid for by the association, or something at my house didn't get paid for by the union, or whatever. I don't feel confident saying I can categorically rule it out. Now, this is work that was done...
I wonder if the rest of that answer might be read to the witness, Commissioner.
Certainly.
At least down to the words that I hadn't paid for.
Certainly. I'll go right back to the beginning.
I can't see how it's happened if you just read it.
You say, I believe that must be the source of the rumour. That must be the factual construct behind what has become the rumour about the association or Bruce or the union or whoever paying for work on my house. And I don't, obviously, given I've been fairly surprised by events to date in relation to this matter, I can't categorically rule out that something at my house didn't get paid for by the association or something at my house didn't get paid for by the union or whatever. I don't feel confident saying I can categorically rule it out, but I can't see how it's happened because that really is the only bit of work that I would identify that I hadn't paid for. So that was the position as at the date of the interview.
Yes, and for completeness it goes on, the interview.
Yes.
And it seems, just looking at the receipts and how much I borrowed and all the rest of it, that I basically paid full value for everything else. Yes. So it doesn't seem to me, looking at the house and working it through mentally, that there is sort of thousands of dollars of free, unexplained work lying around in the house. It seems to me that I've paid, relatively ordinary funds for the work to get done, and I just don't see where there could be big money coming from any other source into the renovations.
Well, you're talking there about big money.
I'm talking there at various points. I'd used the phrase big money once, that's
Yes.
true. And then I talk about I basically paid full value for everything else.
But I'd like to come back to what's on 153. I can't categorically rule out that something at my house didn't get paid for by the association, or something at my house didn't get paid for by the union. Now that's only, well, it's less than a year after the work was done.
So this interview is in September 1995.
Yes.
And the work was done in September, October, November the year before, so that's right, less
That's
than a
right.
year.
It's less than a year later, and you're unable to rule out that at least some funds had come from the association or from the union.
Well, it had never been suggested to me or occurred to me in any way before this time in 1995 that anybody else was contending they had paid for any part of the renovations. It was just not controversial. Got renovations done at my home and I paid for them. It became controversial in 1995. I took steps to check. Some of those steps are discussed in this interview, took further steps after it.
Well, the interview was 11 September. By that stage, there were rumours swirling around the firm about corrupt conduct and the like, that's right?
During this time, of course, there were issues of controversy within the firm. Yes, absolutely.
Well, you heard the evidence of Mr Murphy yesterday, I take. I should say Justice Murphy yesterday, I take.
I've read the transcript of Mr Murphy's evidence.
All right, and you don't take issue with what he said about rumours swirling around the firm about
no,
corrupt
I
conduct?
don't broadly take issue with it, no.
And those matters were all coming out from about mid-July onwards?
I'd say in August, I think Mr Murphy's evidence is August and September, but obviously that can be checked.
Well, it can be. Well, we don't need to check it.
But in and around this period in 1995, certainly.
Yes, because Mr Wilson came to you first, did he not?
As is indicated in this interview,
Yes.
yes, that's right. I received some instructions from Mr Wilson.
And you declined to act for him?
I referred him to Mr Murphy. I thought that was the appropriate course of conduct.
Why did you regard that as the appropriate course of conduct?
I thought, given the nature of what he was telling me, that it was a more appropriate matter for Mr Murphy, given our personal relationship.
And did you regard yourself as in a position of conflict between a duty that you might owe to him personally by reason of his being your client in respect of the association and the duties that you owe to the AWU by reason of their being Slater and Gordon's client?
You've made an assumption in that question, Mr Stolger, which isn't right. The instructions that Mr Murphy provided me were about the Members' Welfare Fund, and it was having received those instructions that I referred him to Mr Murphy.
I think you said in that answer that Mr Murphy gave you instructions. You meant Mr Wilson.
I meant
yes.
Mr Wilson. Sorry, I misspoke.
Well, that may be so, that he gave you instructions about the members' welfare account, but in any event, he had been your client in his personal capacity in respect of the association matter.
Yes, but in my mind at that time, receiving those instructions, there were no connection between the two.
I see. You say in both in your evidence today and for that matter in your interview, the record of interview at page 153 going over to page 154 that in particular looking at the top of page 154, I basically paid full value for everything else. Doesn't seem to me, looking at the house, working through it, there's thousands of dollars of free, unexplained work lying around in the house. And you hadn't got any quotes or anything like that, had you?
No, but what I was referring to at that time is what I'd paid for the various things that had been done.
But you weren't able to say with any precision what the cost of, or whether the amounts paid would cover the actual cost of doing those works.
What I was able to estimate is, what renovations, looking at the renovations, looking at receipts, looking at invoices. I knew what I'd paid, and I was able to form a view about whether or not that was a fair amount. If there was something that had been done that no payment had ever been made for, that's what I was looking for.
You had no expertise or training or experience in making estimates of that kind, did you?
No, I'm not a quantity surveyor or anything like that, Mr. Stolger, but
And it was the first large building job you'd done on your house?
It was the first, I had Mr. James around and paid him on 3 occasions,
Yes.
so I had an idea of what woodwork and structural work and glasswork cost. I'd had the kitchen done, had tradespeople around for that, so I had some idea about what cupboards and their installation and matters associated with plumbing and the installing of a kitchen cost. I also had an understanding of how much all of this had cost. I'd extended my mortgage by $20,000. I'd received a prepayment from Slater and Gordon.
Yes.
I obviously had some funds from my salary that I'd amassed in savings. You know, we've got to remember the differences in money between then and now. This is a house that I'd bought for $152,000. So when you were talking about works at the home well in excess of $20,000, that's a lot to spend on a renovation. So across all of that and checking receipts, working it through, I could ascertain for myself that work that had been done had been paid for.
You'd observed, I withdraw that, you've read the evidence of Mr Wilson in this commission?
Yes, I have.
And you know that even from reading that evidence, that even Mr Wilson accepts he received various significant payments of cash from the Workplace Reform Association?
I know Mr Wilson has given evidence about the Workplace Reform Association, yes. Yes, I do.
You know
But not
that
in
Mr
connection,
Wilson's
not in
evidence
connection
is
with this.
that he received, even Mr Wilson's evidence is that he received various significant payments in cash from the Workplace Reform Association. Is that right?
That's my understanding of his evidence.
For
but
example,
not in relation to the matters we are discussing now.
On the 12th of October 2003, he says he was handed $8,000 in cash, which he used for a shop stewards committee. Do you remember that?
I've got no knowledge of those things other than reading
Yes.
the documents before this commission.
That's so. And then in November 2003, he says he received $8,000 in cash and he spent it on computers, a printer, fax machine, and answering machine.
Oh, once again, I've read the documents before this commission.
Do you remember him buying that equipment?
No, I do not.
Did you wonder?
2003, John.
I said 2003.
Yeah.
Well, did you observe whether or not he purchased computers, a printer, fax machine, and answering machine in November 2003? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
19. I'm sorry. In 1993.
I don't recall him purchasing office equipment then.
And then,
I'm not able to assist you as to whether or not it occurred. I don't know.
and just for clarity, his evidence was that on 12th of October 1993 he was handed $8,000 for a shop stewards committee.
Well, once again, the only thing I know about that is that it's in the documents before this commission.
And Mr Wilson also said he received $5,000 from Mr Blewett and he used it for telephone bills, office supplies, etc.
Once again, all I know about that is it's in the documents before this commission.
You were in a relationship with him at the time. Did you notice whether or not during 93 he had significant amounts of cash on him?
I never saw Mr Wilson with significant amounts of cash.
And did you ever wonder whether Mr Wilson had some other source of income that he was using?
No, there was nothing about his conduct which caused me to wonder.
Well, did Mr Wilson tell you that at a period in 93 or I think 94 he became angry with Mr Blewett because he thought that Mr Blewett had taken funds from the association's account?
No.
Never mentioned that to you?
Never.
You've given evidence about Mr James. You said that he did work over a considerable period.
Yes, he did.
And you got on well with him?
yes, I mean, he was there a lot, so I chatted to him, yes.
And he was a careful person to your observation?
Oh, well, he did the work well. I obviously would let him in the morning and go to work and leave him to it, but
Yes.
he did the work diligently and well.
And he provided you with invoices and receipts and the like?
Yes, he did.
And you told him on a number of occasions that Mr Wilson was paying for the renovations?
It's completely untrue.
Because Mr Wilson was in fact paying for the
It's just not
renovations.
true,
That's
Mr.
right, isn't
Stolger.
it?
Just not true.
And you also told Mr James that as Bruce brought you cash, you would be in a position to pay his bill.
That's just not true.
Now, Mr Hems's evidence is that at a certain point he paid some of $5,000 money into your account. You're aware of that?
I'm aware that's Mr Hems's evidence.
And you've dealt with this publicly before. Your position in a nutshell is that you say you don't remember the $5,000 being paid into your bank account.
I've dealt with all of this publicly before. I don't remember the $5,000 being paid into my bank account. $5,000 in those days was a lot of money.
Yes.
I think I would remember it had it occurred. I've taken every step possible to procure my bank records from the time.
Yes.
I wish I was in a position, Mr Stolger, to give them to you today, because I think that they would disprove this assertion by Mr Hem. We're in the unfortunate position that given the many years since,
Yes.
banks don't retain records for that time.
Can I just ask you about a different aspect of Mr Hems's evidence? You deal with this in your third witness statement. I'm not sure whether you have it there.
Yes, I do.
Or it's page 4 of the bundle, if that helps. But
That's all right, I've got my third witness statement.
if you go to paragraph 5, you're dealing there with a number of paragraphs of Mr Hem's statement. I can take you to them if you like, but in a nutshell, his evidence in those paragraphs was to the effect that he went with, I think it was Mr Telecostaglu, to the Abbotsford house, and he observed Mr Telecostaglu handing over an envelope of cash to people working at the house. And your response to that is, to the best of my recollection, the painting at my home in Abbotsford was undertaken earlier than mid-1995. Now, pausing there, that you say it was done in late 94, is that right? Or September, October, November-ish.
Yes, that's right.
And you say, I have no reason to believe that payment for any section of it, that's the painting, was made by any person other than me. I have no knowledge of Bill, that's Mr Telecostaglu, attending my property and purportedly paying any one or more of the tradespeople as described in the statement. Now, you don't deny what's in Mr Hem's statement, do you?
Mr Stolger, I'm not in a position to give eyewitness evidence about an event that I wasn't at, but I can say this. In accordance with our earlier discussion, I checked my expenditure in relation to my renovations and satisfied myself that I paid for it in full. I can also say in relation to Mr Hem's statement that he does not accurately describe the home in which I lived, and I can also say in relation to Mr Hem's statement that he records a series of tradespeople being there together doing jobs, and those jobs were done at separate times. That is, that there was no time when that combination of tradespeople was at work in the home.
Well, but what you say is, I have no reason to believe that payment for any section of it was made by any person other than me. I'm just trying to understand that a bit better. You mean you have no reason to believe, as you sit here today, that the payment for any section of it was made by any person other than me. And I have no knowledge of Bill attending my property. I mean, you accept that then, do you, that it's a possibility that Mr Telecostaglu or Mr Collins may have arranged for some painters on behalf of Mr Wilson to come to the Abbotsford property?
No, I don't.
And may have paid them directly for work that they carried out on that property?
No, because that would have become apparent to me when I looked through the payments that I made for the work, that there was painting that was done that I hadn't paid for. I would also have thought that Mr Hem would be in a position to correctly describe the property. I would also have thought Mr Hem would be in a position to correctly describe the tradespeople who were at the property when he said he visited. Given that Mr Hem's not in either of those positions, he's got the nature of the property wrong, the layout of it wrong, he's got the combination of tradespeople wrong, and I checked that I paid for the work. No, I don't think it's possible.
How do you know he's got the combination of, or the number of tradespeople wrong?
Because he's, in his statement, talks about who's doing what at the home, and those functions were done at different points.
Well, you don't say that in your statement, that he's got the tradespeople wrong.
No, we've put it in the statement. To the best of my recollection, the painting at my home in Abbotsford was undertaken earlier than mid-1995. That's the reference.
You're familiar, I take it, with the evidence that Mr Blewett gave to this commission?
Yes, I am.
And Mr Blewett gave evidence in May of this year to the effect that he had gone to the Abbotsford house and he handed some money to Mr Wilson, who then handed it to some tradesmen. Now, he was clear in his evidence that you were not present at the time that the money was handed over. He said only Mr Wilson did that. But it's possible that that could have been some of the workmen that Mr Collins or Mr Wilson organised. Do you accept that?
Oh, I've read Mr Blewett's evidence. Once again, I'm not in a position to give eyewitness evidence at an event that, an alleged event, I should have been saying alleged all along. I'm not in a position to give evidence about an alleged event I wasn't present at, but I can say two things.
Yes.
Number one, I checked my receipts and expenditures and satisfied myself that I had paid for all of the work at my Abbotsford property. And number two, the circumstances that Mr Blewett describes are inherently improbable. I worked full-time. I worked hard as a lawyer at Slater and Gordon. Mr Wilson worked full-time. He worked hard as a union official. There would not have been times that we were sitting at my home while tradespeople were working. Tradespeople would have been working during the week when I was at work, and so was Mr Wilson.
Can we come to a period a bit earlier than the time of the exit interview? Now, I asked you a bit about this before, but in around about July or perhaps early August 1995, Mr Wilson came to you and gave you some instructions about the members' welfare account, and then you handed that over to Mr Murphy. When did you discover what had been happening with the Workplace Reform Association?
I object to that question. It's entirely clear what is meant by what had been happening with the Workplace Reform Association.
I won't debate it, Commissioner. When did you first discuss, in the period after Mr Wilson had come to give you initial instructions, whether with Mr Wilson or anyone else, the topic of the Workplace Reform Association?
My answer to that, and I do feel like I need to be a bit careful here, I referred, as my statement from 1995 records, I referred Mr Wilson to Mr Murphy. Mr Murphy, subsequent to that event, spoke to me about matters Mr Wilson had given him instructions on. It's my understanding, and given we're in a room full of lawyers, I'll defer to others, but it's my understanding that there's some contest around the privilege associated with those matters, and I don't want to make an error about them.
I don't think there's any contest about the privilege, just a question of avoiding infringing it.
Yeah, certainly.
But I'm not asking you about the members' welfare account. I'm asking you about the association. Let me put it this way. Perhaps I'll come at it this way. You've agreed with me that rumours were swirling in August, September 1995 in Slater and Gordon about the possibility of corrupt conduct.
There were rumours swirling in Slater and Gordon, yes, and in some sections of the trade union movement.
And in part that related to the corrupt use of monies in connection with the acquisition of the property at Kerr Street?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, no. I think the first wave of rumours were really around the members' welfare account. There were some rumours about renovations at my home, and that all stemmed from Mr. Spiridis going to the AWU looking for payment, and I deal with that in my statement and in the interview in 1995. There were, general publicity. There were articles in the newspaper about police being involved. A little bit later on, a Victorian state parliamentarian got involved. So, yes, all of these things were sort of swirling around. To the specific, issues about Kerr Street and the Workplace Reform Association, not really in a position to go to that without perhaps troubling people on privilege questions.
Well, if you come to page 145 of the interview...
145 of the interview, yes.
Yes, so that's tab 3. You're asked, during the course of 93 and 94, were you aware of any transactions relating to the West Australian account, the Workplace Reform Association's account? You say, no, I was not. Were you aware of any donations being made to it? No, I wasn't. Were you aware of any payments being made to Slater and Gordon from that account? No, I wasn't. Is it your belief today that any monies have been paid to Slater and Gordon from out of that account for any purpose at all? Not that I know of. I'm not aware of any monies being paid to Slater and Gordon from that account. Now, so clearly by this stage, 11 September 1995, the Workplace Reform Association was on the table as a matter for discussion.
Yes, I agree with that.
And there was a concern as to whether payments had been made to Slater and Gordon from an account associated with the Workplace Reform Association.
Clearly, Mr. Shaw and Mr. Gordon thought it was a relevant topic for the asking of questions, yes.
And presumably that payment of money was the 67-odd thousand that I took you to a bit earlier on in the examination, the cheque drawn on the account that found its way into Slater and Gordon's trust account.
With respect, I don't think Ms Gillard can answer that. Commissioner?
Well, it's a matter for Ms Gillard to indicate whether she can or she can't.
Are you able to answer it, Ms. Gillard?
No, I'm not. Sequence of events here is instructions are given to Bernard Murphy. Mr Murphy, or Justice Murphy, yesterday gave as much evidence as he could without intruding on privileged matters about then declining to further act for Mr Wilson or the AWU and the partnership then making some inquiries about all of this. I'm really not in a position to take it any further than that.
Well, when Mr Wilson first approached you about this matter, was he talking to you in the context of his relationship with you, or was he seeking out your legal advice?
When Mr Wilson came to discuss with me the members' welfare account, he came to Slater and Gordon. He was raising it with me in my capacity as a solicitor. I felt uncomfortable about acting on the matter. I referred it to Mr Murphy.
Yes, and that's the members' welfare account. What I want to ask you about is the Workplace Reform Association, which is what is being dealt with on 145. And clearly, you had, by 11 September, you had 95, you had found out more about the Workplace Reform Association?
Well, I hadn't, in the sense that when Mr Wilson came in to give me instructions about the members' welfare account, the only account of concern under discussion at that time was the members' welfare account. I referred the matter to Mr Murphy. Mr Murphy took more comprehensive instructions. Subsequent to that, obviously the partnership then took a series of steps, and one of those steps was the discussion with me, and the record of it is before you.
Well, did you give consideration to alerting the AWU to the fact that monies have been travelling in or out of the Workplace Reform Association's account?
Well, for my state of knowledge and for what I was doing, I was not the partner, or either of the partners, any of the partners. I was not amongst the partners who were making inquiries about this matter.
Did you raise it with Mr Wilson just in your personal capacity to say what on earth is going on?
Subsequent to these events, I had a discussion with Mr Wilson where he was evasive, and I formed the view that I had not been fully in the picture about the nature of his conduct, and I took steps to end our relationship.
Well, that had already occurred, that conversation, I take it, by the time of the interview?
Yes, that's right. And I think it's referred to in the interview at the end.
I asked you some questions about your involvement in incorporated associations with any other unions. Did you ever... well, you're familiar with Ms Darvanese?
Yes, I know Ms Darvanese.
From the HSU?
And she's in Victorian Parliament.
Yes, and back in, well, the period from 89, she was the secretary of the No. 2 branch, the HSU.
Yes, she was.
And Slater and Gordon commenced doing work for the No. 2 branch.
Yes, we did.
And it did that work through you?
Some through me, not exclusively through me.
And did you have a meeting with Ms Darvanese and Mr Elliott at their home in Melbourne, at which you discussed the possibility of setting up a incorporated association?
No.
Before you answer that, back in the early 90s?
I obviously was in a position to watch the evidence given this morning. Right. No, I did not have such a meeting with them.
And did you... I'm not asking whether you set it up, I'm asking whether you questioned Ms Darvanese in particular as to whether she would be interested in establishing such a fund.
No, I did not.
Mr Elliott, as you'll know from the evidence this morning, in 2002 made a statement, in 2012 made a statement. In this morning he said that the statement was incorrect, so I'm just putting you in the picture about what his evidence was. But can I ask you this, was there a reform group operating in the HSU in the late 80s involving Ms Darvanese and Mr Elliott?
Yes, there was.
And did you give both legal advice and political counsel to that reform group from time to time?
Oh, I was supportive of Mr... Well, at that point it was Kay Williams. She subsequently reverted to her maiden name, which is Darvanese. I was supportive of Kay Williams and Mr Elliott's campaign in the HSU. I didn't give them any advice about incorporating an association, but yes, I was politically supportive of their campaign.
And what Mr Elliott said in his statement was that it was generally understood that success for Ms Gillard's allies in union elections was a benefit to Ms Gillard's political career, and in turn Ms Gillard's advancement would benefit those unions and the union movement generally. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I would say I had a view that Ms Williams would be a competent union official. As it was, you know, these events you're taking me to, I think 89, 90, is that right?
Well, the date is a little uncertain, but it's 89 at the earliest and probably in the early 90s, as I understood the evidence this morning.
Yes, and as you may well be able to research about my political career, it took me until the 1998 election to be successfully pre-selected and elected.
Now, I'll just put this to you for your comment, Ms Gillard. You can tell me whether you agree with it or not. He says, or he said, I should say, in 56 of his statement, such was the closeness of the political relationship that Ms Gillard felt able on one occasion to offer at a meeting of me, her and another senior HSU official, and I'll ask you to assume that's Ms Darbanese, to undertake legal work to establish a fundraising entity outside of the union to raise funds for the re-election in the HSU of the officers of that entity, but established for the ostensible purpose of promoting occupational health and safety in the health industry. Is that a correct statement?
No. As in, the event referred to did not happen.
And he says this offer was not taken up by me or others. He said in paragraph 57, this offer was not taken up by me or others on the basis that it seemed an exotic and suspect arrangement, particularly since the promotion of workplace health and safety was the proper preserve of the union itself. Did Mr Elliott or Ms Darbanese ever say anything to you to that effect?
No.
Excuse me just one moment, Commissioner. Nothing further, thank you, Commissioner.
Yes. Mr. Galbally, do you have any questions?
I do.